Hello, and welcome to Securing Justice, a housing insecurity podcast series brought to you by the California Center for Ethics and Policy in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences at Cal Poly Pomona. This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can learn more about Cal Humanities at calhum.org. My name is Alex Madva, and as director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, and on behalf of the CCEP Faculty Fellows co-organizing Securing Justice, namely Brady Collins, Corey Aragon, and Michael Wu, we are pleased to bring you our final event of the semester. But first, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, and I'm putting the link in the chat now. So today's presentation is entitled The Physical Legacy of Racism, How Redlining Cemented the Modern Built Environment by Brian Ahn, Anthony Orlando, and Seva Rodnyansky. They argue that redlining has shaped the geography of housing segregation, not just that of racial segregation, by determining the predominant locations of single-family and multifamily homes. They explore how the effects of historical built environments have persisted over time and continue to shape our world today. Dr. Brian Ahn is assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. His research examines urban policy, public finance, governance reform, and social equity issues in local public service, focusing on the role of institutions in shaping policy and planning effectiveness. Dr. Seva Rodnyansky is an assistant professor in the Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Occidental College. He teaches courses on quantitative data analysis, and his research focuses on urban policy related to housing, transportation, migration, and neighborhood change. And Dr. Anthony Orlando is Cal Poly Pomona's own assistant professor of finance, real estate, and law. He teaches and conducts research at the intersection of business, economics, and law. Many of you may remember Dr. Orlando as the moderator of our first CCEP event of the semester on housing justice from Trump to Biden. You can learn more about each of our panelists, as well as find a preprint or early draft of today's paper at the following links. On that note, please bring your virtual hands together as I hand the digital mic over to our speakers.
Thanks, Alex. We really appreciate the opportunity. This is a lot of fun. Usually when we present research like this, it's just one of us. So the fact that Zoom allows all three of us to be in one place at one time is kind of rare. So we're going to have some fun with it by kind of breaking it up into pieces. And my co-authors have been incredibly generous in allowing me to get the ball rolling by talking about something that's not in the paper at all, which is a little bit of a new book that I've written, which is also about redlining. So I'm going to kind of set up the story for you, what redlining is and why it happened. And then I'm going to pass it over to them to talk more about what our research actually shows. So let me just share the screen here and we'll get going with that. So most of you who are here probably know what redlining is, but let me just give the basic quick definition. Redlining is a process that happened starting in the 1930s and leading into the 1960s, where the federal government encouraged banks and other mortgage lenders to lend predominantly in certain neighborhoods in cities and not in others. They drew maps of the cities, they broke them up into different color codes, and the ones that had red lines around them were the areas that lenders were supposed to avoid. Those areas were predominantly housing people of color, foreign immigrants, Jewish, Catholic immigrants, etc. As a result, redlining has become a term that's associated with racial discrimination. Now, that's very much true, and I'm going to tell a little bit of that story about how race motivated redlining in a moment. But what we're going to talk about, especially in this paper, is not just how it's affected race, but as Alex said, how it's affected the built environment and shaped our cities even to this very day. So here's a little preview of what Brian and Seva are going to dive into when they really get to the numbers. The question is, how have long-term effects of discriminatory redlining in the US persisted? Now, we know from a lot of research that's been done that they have persisted, that we can see that there's racial segregation that still exists because redlining happened decades ago. We can see that home ownership rates differ in certain areas because of redlining. We can even see that crime rates differ. But one of the things that this research has had a difficulty doing is nailing down exactly why, what happened to these neighborhoods that even after redlining ended, even after the federal government stopped telling lenders that they had to focus on some neighborhoods instead of others, why do the effects continue to persist? And we're going to argue that one really key reason is because during those decades of redlining, certain types of buildings got built there, particularly apartment buildings, a lot of unfortunately low quality apartment buildings, because the people who lived there couldn't get mortgages. So there was no reason to build nice, well-built single family homes. Those homes wound up in the areas that weren't redlined. And so the city not only segregated racially, but also segregated in terms of real estate. And so even to this day, we might find that the neighborhoods look different in terms of the physical structures. And as a result of the effects that those physical structures have on people's lives and on the real estate market, we might actually be able to see it in outcomes like prices and rents. Now, let me step back and tell you why this all happened in the first place. Everyone knows the story of the Civil War in the United States, and most people know the story of Reconstruction thereafter, when the Union Army, the Northern Army that won, occupied the South for about a decade after the Civil War to ensure that the end of slavery actually was the end of slavery, to ensure that Black Americans actually did have their civil rights protected. Most people don't know as much about what came thereafter, a period that historians call the Redemption. And that's really the key to launching us on this path towards segregation. Because redemption is when the Northern Army left and the South started to reinforce parts of the caste system, even though they couldn't technically bring slavery back. Little by little, they found ways to ensure that the caste system where white Americans were given privileges over Black Americans continued to persist. Now, at first, a lot of this was economic segregation, that Black workers were forced to take very low-paying jobs, that they were bound by debt to their employers, and it was very difficult, if not impossible, for them to leave. But after a while, that economics turned into a safety issue. The famous sociologist Edna Bonasich in the 1970s came up with this phrase that I love, a split labor market. And a split labor market is the idea that if there is a group of workers who are feeling that their jobs are threatened because there aren't enough jobs to go around, then what tends to happen is often they find ways to separate from each other. One group will try to make sure that they keep the jobs and they keep another group out of them. The reason this is important for our story is because in the late 19th century, moving into the early 20th century, we start to see that violence against Black Americans, which was always present, is increasing even more. Lynchings are growing. The rate of lynchings is increasing during this time period. And through Bonasich's work, we can see that a lot of this has to do with the fact that low-wage white workers are feeling threatened. The economy in the South was stumbling during this time period. They wanted to protect their jobs. They didn't want Black workers threatening their jobs. And so that was one of many reasons why they resorted to violence. Of course, all of this is built upon a time when a narrative of white supremacy already existed and enabled them to come up with this violent solution. One of the things that we see in the social science research is in the counties and the times when lynchings are increasing, that is the time when Black Americans are starting to leave. You know, one of the myths about migrations is that they're driven mostly by economics. A lot of economists have studied this, and it's actually very difficult to get people to move simply because they can get higher wages somewhere else. Black Americans didn't just move to the North because they could get better jobs. They left because their physical safety was so threatened, and it was becoming increasingly threatened. And so through the early 20th into the mid 20th century, we see what we now call the Great Migration, when millions of Black Americans left the South and moved to the North and the West into the cities. And the reason this matters is because this is the largest influx of Black Americans that cities have ever experienced. This is a time when the white Americans who have lived there are going to see the demographics of their cities changing, and they're going to react to that. Now, initially, when the Black Americans arrive in a city like here, I've got Chicago in 1930, they're going to be concentrated in a very small area. Most of that is due to economics at first. If you look here in Cook County, the darker areas are the areas that have higher percentages of the black population relative to white population. This is what we historically call the South Side of Chicago. Right up here on the northeast corner of the South Side, that was the train station that you would arrive in if you were coming up from New Orleans or anywhere else in the South, that train line that stretched all the way straight from New Orleans up to Chicago and beyond. The main terminal was right there. If you went north of there, you'd be in the downtown area where all the jobs were. That's not a place where you're going to live. But if you turned and you moved south, right along here, this is where all the rail lines are. You passed through it when you came into the station. So you've got the rail line here, and you've got a lot of manufacturing plants, and it's not a very nice area to live. You don't want to be near all the soot and the smoke. So who lives there? It's the people who can't afford to go anywhere else. It's primarily Black Americans and foreign immigrants. So at first, segregation is largely driven by economics. What we're going to see is that as the 20th century progresses and Black incomes rise and they have the ability to move into other parts of the city, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be allowed to. And that is where segregation takes on a much different flavor because it's driven by policies like redlining. You can see here that during this time period, the emigration out of the South was tremendous. This is annual numbers. 8% of the Black population leaves, 4% leaves, and then in the decadal. And then in the 1940s, 12% leaves. And they're going to all three of these regions increasingly. It doesn't look this way at all for white Americans. There is migration of white Americans, primarily people moving out to the West, but it is not this huge resorting, this reshaping of the demographics of the cities. So the Great Migration leads white Americans to start thinking differently about these neighborhoods and about whether they want to concentrate certain people in certain areas because they don't want to live near them. At around this time, the cities take off. Everybody hears about the Roaring 20s. One of the things I talk about in my book is people don't realize how much of that was driven by real estate. It was a housing boom. Mortgages took off during this time period. Whether you measure it in billions of dollars or you measure it by percentage growth rates, the early 1920s, up until that point in American history, this was the largest housing boom and mortgage boom we'd ever seen. And then it starts to turn down. And as I argue in my book, this is one of the things that led to the Great Depression, is the fact that in the late 1920s, this market is cooling off and people are starting to have difficulty paying off these mortgages. And so we see that in the 1920s, we've got this great boom in construction, residential construction and housing starts. And then this is the Great Depression here where it plummets. And the reason this matters for our story is because redlining is fundamentally about whether people can get mortgages in different neighborhoods. And what happens during the Great Depression is that the government needs to find a way to help all these people who are having difficulty paying their mortgage. And so they're going to create a new entity that can help them. But in the process of doing that, they're going to make an important decision about what parts of the country can get mortgages and what can't. And that is the decision that's going to linger through the mid-20th century. And you can see here the crash in terms of mortgages as well. Let's now talk about the decisions that they made, and then Brian and Sieva can pick up on the effects of those decisions. Franklin Roosevelt gets Congress to introduce and eventually to pass the Homeowners Loan Act. The way it works is very simple. There are all these people who are in foreclosure. They're about to lose their homes. They've got mortgages that they can't afford. He says to them, we're going to create a corporation, a federally owned corporation, and this corporation is going to take the mortgage off the bank's hands. We're going to give them a bond that they can receive guaranteed payments for. So the banks are happy. They don't have this mortgage that nobody's paying anymore. And then they're going to turn to the borrowers and they're going to say, we're going to renegotiate your mortgage. We're going to stretch it out over more years. We're going to make it more affordable so that people can stay in their homes. And it's wildly popular. They get hundreds of thousands of applications. They eventually, over time, it takes about a year and a half, they eventually refinance 1 million mortgages throughout the country. And I should say, at this point, they're not redlining yet. They give the mortgages both to predominantly Black neighborhoods, predominantly white neighborhoods, neighborhoods with foreign immigrants, neighborhoods with Americans who are native born. And in fact, a lot of the low-income communities have some of the highest repayment rates. However, they realized that the corporation was only created to help people who are in foreclosure. What about all the other Americans out there who can't get mortgages or who are defaulting on their mortgages? How can they help stimulate the private sector to start lending again? And that is when they have the idea, we will send appraisers out throughout the land to every major city, and we will have them draw maps and divide up the cities into neighborhoods that are good to bad. You know, the green and the blue areas are the best grades, and the red areas are the areas that they say have declined. That's the language that they use when they draw the maps. The yellow areas are also pretty bad because they're called definitely declining areas. And this way, they're trying to help lenders, give them the confidence to say, hey, we've picked the neighborhoods for you that are safe. Go back out there and stimulate the economy. Just make sure you stay away from these areas. Well, this is Chicago again. This is Cook County. This is the Homeowners Loan Corporation's map. A few years later, the Federal Housing Administration, which offers government insurance, comes along and does the same thing. Before you know it, banks throughout the country are drawing their own maps, following these maps very, very carefully. And that means for the next 30 years, people who live in these neighborhoods have a very difficult time getting access to affordable credit. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to tell the next part of the story.
Okay. Okay, thanks for wonderful presentation, Anthony. It's very motivating, very interesting background before we get into the main research findings. So, given what Dr. Orlando has already said, we now specifically examine what is the effect of redlining on contemporary neighborhood performance. But as he said, there has been many papers that has documented all this evidence, which I will go over in a minute. But we will, more importantly, we will examine why. So that would be the key contribution that we want to bring to the literature and the scholarly and policy discussion. So thanks to Fair Housing Act of 1968, redlining was outlawed. But still, several studies have documented that it has shown long-term effects. Usually what researchers have done is they compared lower graded neighborhoods, namely C or D graded, to better higher graded neighborhoods such as A or B. And what they have found so far, by and large, is that lower graded neighborhood compared to higher graded ones show still higher racial segregation, lower levels of home ownership, and lower home values, and lower credit scores. And also, similar studies have found that lower graded communities have fewer occupied housing structures and more vacancy units, and therefore less valued lower housing values. And on top of this, in addition to these housing market outcomes, others also have found that redlining might have increased the crime rate in lower graded neighborhood, specifically in Los Angeles, per Anderson's 2018 study. And people have also found suppressed effect on housing and how population and housing units. And Capps and Lobenwich, they found that residents in lower graded neighborhoods still face higher denial rate in mortgage borrowing. And even if they succeed in borrowing, still the amounts they could borrow was much lower than counterparts living in higher graded neighborhoods. And lastly, there is a body of research that has examined its redlining implications on public health, and finding that lower graded neighborhoods still show higher infant mortality rate, higher diabetes incidence, and exposed to higher hazardous toxic release, as well as higher imprisonment rates. So these papers summarize the growing body of evidence regarding the long-term effect of redlining. Okay, but our question is a little bit different. Our question is why and how did it happen? Right, let's think about this. If redlining was outlawed in 1968, then why would we still see these persistent effects of redlining on neighborhood outcomes when people are allowed now to move, right? So that's our motivating research question. And here we focus on the built environment. So what do we mean by built environment? So in this paper, in this research, we argue that because of redlining, residents, mostly minority and people of color in the lower graded neighborhoods had significant challenges in accessing mortgages. And because of that, they were not able to buy single-family houses. And because of such low demand, real estate industry and developers would not have built single-family houses. They would have instead built multi-family apartments. Then people can move, people can come and go over time. But once you put lots of multi-family apartment units, it becomes exceedingly hard to demolish those structures. So we argue that these built environments created by redlining should be sticky, and that's what shapes all these neighborhood outcomes. So specifically, we focus on 3 outcomes: rent of a neighborhood, housing values, and capitalization rates. And 2 hypotheses are possible. One is you might question that maybe it's not the effect of redlining imparted on the construction of multifamily apartment units, but maybe neighborhoods were just simply too different systematically before even redlining practice. So indeed, much of the previous studies that I mentioned did not control for this mechanism except for one. So we are gonna specifically account for this possibility, so which is called pre-existing trend in research community. But our main hypothesis is number 2. The redlining effects would have persisted through the segregation of a housing stock rather than desegregation of people. And when we say segregation of housing stock, we are specifically talking about the share, the percentage of multifamily apartments in a given neighborhood. And indeed, a body of urban studies have studied spatial path dependence mechanism, meaning that there is a stability in neighborhood performance, whether you measure school performance or income or other socioeconomic indicators. There is a stability that persists over decades. One neighborhood's ranking doesn't really change over time. And people have studied why, and they have suggested that maybe partly it's because of urban system design, meaning that it's historically discriminatory urban policies that may shape all these spatial path dependence. So our research question and hypothesis is in line with this body of literature. And okay. And what are the theories that we would use? So in economic geography and activity, there are three prominent theories, which has been really used in real estate pricing studies. So we borrow these three theories. So what are they? First is increasing returns proposed by Krugman, which is there can be a shock to place, such as redlining or bombing during the wartime. But once that happens, such positive or negative effects will multiply. And we don't know what fosters, what triggers the clustering of the capital or good amenities. But once it happens, it will multiply. So in our study context, the redlining is kind of on the shock. So we according to this theory, we would expect that the effect of redlining, the negative effect of redlining, will be persistent over nearly 8 decades. Now, second, another theory we could use is we explore is random growth model. And what this theory says is that, okay, there can be a negative shock at one time, but it's just one-time shock. It doesn't really change the trajectory of the growth of place or economic activity. Okay, so that long-term growth is more or less random, it's stochastic process. So one-time shock cannot really affect the long-term trajectory of the growth. That's the random growth. The last theory we explore is locational fundamentals, also developed by Krugman. So what this theory suggests is that cities form around advantageous or disadvantageous geographical features. So even though there would be a negative shock, such as redlining, the effects will dissipate, will decline over time, or even reverse if it was done to the cities or neighborhoods that formed around fundamentally advantageous geographic locations. So in the end, fundamentals will prevail. Okay, so we consider all these three different theories that could be complementary each other, and and how do we use these theories? Okay, there are some mathematical notations, and maybe some of the audience in this panel would like, in this session would like this, but I'm not an economist, so I can walk you over this very easily, step by step. Okay, so don't be scared. So let me try. Okay, so now we are considering what affects the growth rate of housing price. Okay, so here P is price and I is property, T is time. Okay, so this epsilon IT is simply PIT minus PIT minus 1, right? So this is growth rate of price. Then we are thinking about how this shock, such as redlining, can affect the growth rate of price. So we simply put theta, that is a shock, that measures a shock, okay, to the housing price. Then it may be the case that the shock can be persistent over time, right? Just like what increase in return theory argues, or maybe it's not persistent at all, like what random growth theory suggests, or maybe the effect will dissipate over time as proposed by locational fundamentals. So we can think about the price as a function of shock and its persistence, okay? So that's our modeling approach. That's what we have in our model. Then if you sort out all these equations, then we can come up with this final equation, okay? So the growth rate of a price, housing price, or property price, can be a function of shock and its persistence. But let's look at this, beta minus 1, okay? So this is what we are gonna test. And okay, sorry, theta is share of multifamily housing apartments. And I'm gonna talk about what this instrumenting does. So what we do is, if beta equals 1, okay, then this is gone, we only have multifamily housing shares, right? So that indicates there has been only one time shock, and there is no evidence for persistent effect over time. So that's random growth, that would support random growth theory. If beta is less than 1, then you can see that this will be negative, right? So the shocks will decline over time, okay? And that it will be the evidence for locational fundamental theory. If beta is greater than 1, you can see that if the shock will multiply, because this is now positive, right, over time. So that would be the evidence for increase in return theory. Okay, so we use these theories to examine housing price change and which theory among the three would explain the patterns we would observe. That's what we are doing. Okay, so what's our approach after this theory? So eventually we are interested in the neighborhood outcomes, right? And we look at the effect of redlining on this neighborhood outcome through its effect on multifamily housing shares. Okay, and in statistical analysis, we call this instrumental variable regression. The reason we use this is that if we just examine the effect of multifamily housing structure on neighborhood outcome, maybe this multifamily variable is correlated with some variables that we don't include in this equation. So what we are gonna do is, what does redlining do on multifamily housing structure, construction or share over time? And we are gonna carve out that portion in multifamily housing structure share caused by redlining, and we use that portion to predict the outcome of contemporary neighborhood indicators. That's what we do. And of course, there are lots of factors that might affect this outcome. So what we do is we control for these 3 key variables that were available for all these years, starting from 1930 to 2010. So they are control variables we include in both equations. Okay, so what variables we use? So I've talked about 3 key outcome variables. One is weighted average tract rent. Okay, for each census tract, which is a proxy for neighborhood, we use a weighted average rent. Okay, we expect that the effect of redlining through multifamily housing apartment share on this rent would be negative. Number two, we use housing value. It's also weighted average at the census tract level, and these are in dollar terms. Number three, we use tract capitalization rate. In real estate economics, it is actually measured by net operating income divided by market value of the property. But we don't have net operating income variable, so we think that this rent, 12 months equivalent rent amounts will be a reasonable proxy for the net operating income. And the reason why we examine this cap rate is because cap rate actually measures the investment risk, right? So if the higher the risk, the more expected returns, right? So everything being else equal, if you have more multifamily housing apartments because of redlining, then the neighborhood would be considered as more riskier because tenants living in there usually have lower income. The structure is older than single-family housing single-family housing properties, and vacancy rate is higher, and there is less. There is higher turnover from the tenants. So we expect that this variable, the effect on cap rate would be positive, meaning that redlined neighborhoods would be perceived as higher risky neighborhood. Okay, and the key variable interest is the percent of multifamily units of each census tract. Okay, and control variables are these that I mentioned. And when it comes to redlining grade, there are several options we can treat how we treat these redlining grades. The most straightforward approach is linear categorical variable approach, measuring as A is 0, B is 1, C, D, 3, 4. Okay, or we also exclude non-graded tracts. At the time of 1930s, when redlining was established, many census tracts were really less dense. It was very sparse. So in those cases, they didn't receive any grading. So they are non-graded neighborhoods. So we also exclude those neighborhoods. Lastly, we also directly compare grade A to grade B or grade C to B or A. So that's the binary grading approach. And to examine these models and arguments, we use the digitized redlining maps developed by University of Richmond. It's called Mapping Inequality Projects. They digitized all redlining maps for 170 metropolitan areas and cities. But for our purpose, it was very important for us to include the variables in 1930, because this is what would affect the redlining practice and its subsequent effect over time. So for only 10 urban counties, these variables were available, and they are listed here, starting from Pittsburgh up to Boston. So we look at these 10 urban counties specifically, and all data is available from 1930 to 2000, and our unit of analysis is census tracts as a proxy for neighborhood. And because of 8 different decades, this is the number of our sample size, 27,000. And when we spatially joined redlining grade into census tracts using ArcGIS, we are able to match 98% of those census tracts. Okay, so my presentation is up to here, and now Dr. Rodniansky will walk you over our key analysis and findings. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can see my screen. Thank you, Dr. An and Dr. Orlando. So let's recap. I know you guys have been here for a little bit. Dr. Orlando told you guys told you all why and how redlining came about and some of these redlining grades. Dr. An said how our research question really differentiates from that. And just trying to make sure that we're in full screen here. Great. And I'm going to tell you about, okay, well, what did we find and what are some of the pretty pictures we can talk to you about? Okay, so recall Dr. An said we're going to measure two things. We can't necessarily measure the impact of redlining directly on today's housing outcomes because of a variety of bias and errors that might introduce, and other people have tried it. So how do we innovate? So we innovated by doing it in these two steps. Can we compare redlining to multifamily? And then can we compare multifamily to the housing outcomes? So this one, this chart here shows, well, what if we skip that middle step? What if we just did a very direct comparison? Is redlining grade correlated or directly affecting housing variables? So this one shows rents. So I'm going to show you a series of these charts. So I'm going to explain this one and kind of run through the rest. So the lines are colored based on the grades. Again, grade A are the highest and best rated tracts by Holk in 1939, and grade D are the declined or declining ones. And then gray is no grade. And like Professor An explained, those are ones that we consider undeveloped land at that point, or highly commercial land that really had no residential people on it. So this chart here shows the rent, the weighted average rent level in each decade. The thing you should notice is the lines are really, really close to one another. In fact, to kind of the naked eye, there's actually very little differentiation in the rent between grades. And if you didn't know that they were graded differently, you would think, hey, they're graded pretty similarly. The rents are pretty similar. And this, in fact, persists almost out past the 1990s. There's a little more separation in the 2000s and 2010s, but that's about 70 or 80 years after these maps were made. So we think that our approach is a valid approach in that the redlining grades aren't directly affecting rent, at least not for a very long time. Now, what if we do the same thing on housing values, right? The values change on the y-axis, but the picture, at least up through the 70s or 80s, is the same. The housing values in all of these neighborhoods, regardless of the grade, is pretty much the same, though in the highest rated or best rated A grades, this tends to go, there is a bit of separation after the 80s, but again, about 50 years later. We are exploring the separation, but generally speaking, we believe that, again, even here, redlining doesn't directly affect home values. And the cap rate that Dr. An explained, which is kind of the measure of investment risk in a particular place that we're using, also basically shows the same type of pattern where it's not particularly clear that redlining grade directly affects this. There's a little bit more separation in these best neighborhoods, the green grade A, but again, that really only surfaces in 1970 or later, and the separation is not particularly high, maybe 1 percentage point or less, depending on the decade you're talking about. So basic question, does this seem to be a valid strategy, this two-step situation? It does. Okay, so for all of you lovely statisticians and budding data analysts in the room, I am going to show at least one really complicated table. I'm not going to go through everything, but this represents our best statistical models, or sorry, not our best, but the first stage of our statistical models, where we try to show, just like I did in all those pictures, controlling for all of the things that Dr. An introduced. Percentage of Black people, population, the number of units, in some cases, the 1930 percentage of multifamily and 1930 demographics, particular area and year characteristics. We control for all that. do whole grades affect now how many multifamily units there are? And our general answer is yes. The lower the grade, so the more you trend toward grade D, the higher the proportion of multifamily. Now, again, depending on how you measure, I kind of point out in the red boxes here which ones are important, and the more things you control for, the lower that separation is. But in these most declined grade D red areas, it is still a above average proportion of multifamily units, and that persists over time, all the way through 2010, like we're measuring it. Now let's see the picture version of that. Here it's reversed, right? Before we had green on top, now we have red on top. This shows the kind of predictions from our model of multifamily percentages by grade. So we control for all of these other variables. And what you see is there's actually a pretty big separation by neighborhood type between how much multifamily there is. And the 0 on the y-axis is kind of an average amount. So as you see, D and C graded, so declined and declining, in every decade have much more multifamily structures than grade A and grade B. And this is all comparing to undeveloped land, right? So we expect undeveloped land to have much less multifamily than anything else. So this, again, points to that it might not be a direct effect of redlining, but this indirect effect through the cementing of where multifamily properties are built or are not demolished. Now, what if you control for more things like the 1930 percentage of multifamily? So let's pretend that the appraisers at Holk and FHA actually took into account not just the race and religion and immigrants and all of the characteristics that Dr. Orlando explained, but they would also have taken into account how much multifamily is there in a particular neighborhood. So this is that chart. And what do we see? We see that over time, still, there is a separation between all of the grades. And the separation is actually more pronounced after the 1960s, after the law kind of goes out of effect. So not only were these multifamily areas beforehand, they then got labeled as multifamily areas, and then they in fact were driven to invest in more multifamily after the law left. I mean, that's really interesting, and that kind of combines the history, geography, and kind of economic policy that we're trying to show here. Now, what if we include, the whole kitchen sink that we have? We throw in how many, what the population was in 1930, we control for how built up the neighborhood was, what the initial proportion of Black people were in those areas, and then all the stuff I've said before. The picture is roughly the same. The declined neighborhoods and the semi-declined neighborhoods, they still have very elevated proportions of multifamily, right? So regardless of what we throw at it, it works. You do see kind of a little bit of a strange pattern here in the green, and that the best, or kind of quote, the best rated neighborhoods increase in their relative lack of multifamily, I guess, or decrease in their relative lack, but it still doesn't go above the 0 line, and it still doesn't meet the green or the red, right? So there's a little bit of convergence, but not enough to make a real show of it. And it's probably due to some of the urban renewal and kind of interest in city living type luxury development in some of these neighborhoods. Okay, so that's all the first stage. We're still proving why multifamily seems to be affected. I could take out the ungraded. I'm not going to go through this because I think it basically shows the same thing as we did before. So what if we do the whole shebang, the whole model? This is my second complicated table, which I'm not going to go through all again. But basically, what we're all doing here is we're saying, okay, redlining affected multifamily. I just showed you 10 slides that basically prove that. And so how did multifamily affect rents, home values, and cap rates? Well, if you look on these, on the yellow and red boxes on the right, I kind of point out what I think are the most interesting and most impactful point estimates. And point estimates mean that we're showing an average effect over a particular set of constraints. So what we find is that the effect on cap rates from our estimation is about 3 percentage points higher than just a straight no multifamily estimation. And the effect on rents is about $100 to $200 higher as well. And the effects on home values are about 40 to 45,000 higher. So we think that not only is redlining having a long-term effect on these variables, but redlining as measured through its cementing of multifamily is really what's driving the effect. And we think that's really interesting and not something that people are talking about, especially because multifamily in some urban areas, that's really hot, right? That's transit-oriented development, that's luxury condos, maybe that's LIHTC, right? I mean, you could have a lot of different ways of looking at it, whether from the lived experience or from the developer experience, right? But nevertheless, we see these really large differences. Now, if you wanted to say, well, maybe all of your differences were in 1 year, or maybe, this is just a story about the past. It's not a story about the past. These lines on this chart show the effect on cap rates, right? And so we find that this overall model shows us that there's at least a 1, if not more, percentage point effect from having been a poorly graded tract. Now we're trying to, one of the reasons is the why, right? Is this because they're signaling the risk return trade-off in low graded areas? This is sometimes known as the slumlord hypothesis, right? You're not sure that everybody that you're renting to is going to pay you back necessarily, or pay you back in full, or maybe there's higher eviction that you have to do as a property manager, then perhaps you're, it's riskier to invest there. And so maybe this is displaying that, but it's kind of interesting that it's displaying that over, 4 or 5 decades after the policy goes into effect. Now, the effect on home values, we think that, overall from being graded poorly, we think that depending on which decade you look at, right, home values are going to be in different places, but overall, it's certainly lower than kind of you would have had you not been graded. And there possibly, we think, is this because homeowners don't want to live near renters, and so they're continuing to drive the wedge between areas with more multifamily, as we showed, and areas with less. And we do see this funny spike in correction in 1980 and 1990 that we haven't fully explained. So we just want to be transparent about that. And it's the same kind of picture in rents. Rents are lower in graded areas. They continue to be lower over the decades, and there's this kind of somewhat correction back in the 1980s or 90s, which again is 20 years after the law was repealed and 50 years after it was put in place. So we're really kind of trying to guess at and explain long-term effects. And, is this because renters, and so rental units are segregated by income, and so that was cemented, right? We're really trying to battle and explain it out. So that was a lot of data. There was a lot of equations and theories, maybe more than people wanted to see before their weekend starts. So let me sum up where we are, and then what we as a research team is doing, and then turn it over to Alex and to Q&A. So what did we talk about today? We said over this historical process that basically started in the Civil War and went all the way to the 1920s and the 30s, and it mixed together history, the economy, and segregation, people's values and feelings about each other, and the policy kind of denomination of that. And then we said we want to measure this policy directly and indirectly and see if it has an outcome on housing values and housing rents and housing cap rates today. And we showed that, in fact, our indirect strategy is better than the direct one, because redlining grades then don't affect and didn't affect rents and home values and cap rates then or now. But the indirect strategy looking at multifamily percentage does seem to have a real effect. And we kind of quantify that and talk about why that's important. That's what we do. What are we going to do next? We're going to look at each county and see if there's particular effects that we maybe want to highlight. We're also going to try to tighten up our geographic analysis and say, hey, there's been some changes in tracts and tract grades over time, and maybe that's what's driving our results. We're going to try to pull out some of those graphs to 2010. As you saw, our model went to 2010, but our graphs don't, because there's some issues with that part. And then we also tested for individual grades, like if you were curious about C versus D or A versus B, et cetera. We didn't find anything much different than we do now, right? I mean, the overall analysis and the individual analysis are pretty similar. And then we're also working on, what we see as policy implications for today, and we're happy to talk about that more. And we wanted to lead you off with a quote that Dr. Orlando found that was very insightful, right, by the patron saint of urban planning, Jane Jacobs, right? Credit blacklisting maps are accurate prophecies because they are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? This is a little bit in the, if you build it, they will come, or if you don't let them build it, then they won't come kind of notion. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Alex and we'll open it up to Q&A, I think.
I'll steal the mic away from Alex for a minute. So there were a few good questions in the chat, and I want to start with those. And Sieva, I'm going to come back to you because I'm going to say a couple things that I have, but there are a couple questions that are related to gentrification. So I'm going to take Jacqueline's questions in reverse order, and I'll finish with the gentrification one, and Sieva can weigh in a little bit more because he does a lot of research in that area as well. The first question was about the policy implications, right where Sieva ended. People talk about building apartment buildings as a solution to the homelessness crisis, was the question that Jacqueline asked. What does this research mean for that? Is that a good or a bad thing as a result of this? I think one of the things that this research actually fits in well with is the notion that building more housing supply in a particular neighborhood does drive down rents. There's actually a bunch of research that's been coming out in the last couple of years by other urban economists who are doing excellent studies measuring different ways of trying to figure out, different types of buildings and different types of neighborhoods. And it does seem that not necessarily that it decreases rents, but building more housing, especially apartment buildings, does tend to slow down the rent growth, especially in areas that are gentrifying. And that's largely because a lot of these areas currently have a housing shortage. And I want to emphasize that housing shortage because what links what happened back then to today is that another way to think about the concentration of multifamily happening in the 30s and 40s and 50s is look at it from the alternate perspective. Look at it from the suburbs, which are the single family areas. By concentrating the multifamily in one area, you're actually concentrating single family in another area. In other words, what you're doing is you are creating plentiful housing in one area in an area that if you live in a white suburb, you don't want to go anywhere in that area. So sure, stick all the people you don't want in one area, and you're creating an artificial shortage of housing in the predominantly wealthy white suburbs. And that is what the policy was. It was partly to restrict the amount of housing that was there, make sure that the housing was big houses. There are other regulations that go along with redlining, like minimum lot size and things that made sure that the people who could buy in those areas had to be relatively wealthy. And so what we're having happen now is it's not necessarily that kind of a shortage where it's a shortage in one area and multifamily in another. It's that it's just difficult to build in cities nowadays. And so naturally the market in combination with regulations has led to a shortage of housing. And so yes, this research does seem to fit with the idea that building more multifamily could slow down the growth of rents and maybe help with the homelessness crisis. That's, I think, a positive way to look at it. But I think the corollary to that has to be, at least from my perspective, and Brian and Sieva can speak from their perspective, the difference this time has to be that People have to be allowed to live all over the city. They can't be concentrated and segmented in an area that eventually will become potentially a ghetto because it's been isolated and strangled by policy. So the multifamily shouldn't be concentrated the way that it previously was. Your second question is, I think, perfect for our research because it's exactly what we're getting at here. The Jacqueline asks, do people move out of these areas? Is this generational? In other words, are the people who are experiencing the effects of redlining in the 1990s the same families who experienced it in the 1940s? And the answer is, to a large extent, no. There are a lot of families who stay in these areas, but very high moving rates. And so in previous research that came before ours, one of the puzzles they found is, for example, if you look at the redlined areas, you see that the percentage of African-American residents increased up until 1970. And then after redlining was outlawed, it started to decrease. And that is consistent with what we see just generally, which is that racial segregation has decreased in America since 1970. Income segregation has increased, but racial segregation has decreased. We're still a very segregated society, but mathematically, there are a lot more Black residents in areas that used to be all white and so on. And so what the puzzle we were going after was, it seems like some of the outcomes that affect individual people aren't as strong anymore, but outcomes that affect real estate are still very strong, like lower rents and higher cap rates. Why could that be? And that's why we settled on trying to test the effect of the built environment. The idea is that the composition of these neighborhoods in terms of the population may change over time, but whoever lives in these neighborhoods will essentially be stuck with what was built decades before. And so it's kind of a more nuanced story than we originally understood about this. And the last thing with gentrification, Brian raises some really good points in the chat. I'm just going to add in one other thought, which is that, gentrification is, as far as being something that happens a lot, it's a very recent phenomenon. There was not much gentrification happening in redlined communities in the 70s or 80s or 90s. These areas were disinvested from. Residents were leaving. The population was declining in redlined neighborhoods dramatically. White and Black residents were leaving. And the only folks who were staying in a lot of these neighborhoods were unfortunately the least fortunate, who could not leave. And so if you look at the proportion of communities in American cities that really would qualify as gentrifying, which probably means that wealthier folks are moving in, college educated folks are moving in. There are other definitions, and Sieva is going to give a little better than I can on that. It's not a high proportion of communities. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It just means that it's probably very difficult to link that statistically to the redlining that happened back in the 30s. Sieva, you can probably say more about that than I can.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was trying to, Jacqueline, thank you for all your questions. Trying to see if there's more I want to add. I think there's a plausible question here, and I think research plausible and after is that, let's say we're talking about the redlined areas, right? Grade D declined. As we talked before, very, could have been environmentally hazardous, could have had a lot of immigrants, Blacks, Mexican, Jewish, Catholic, etc., whatever way. However, they were formed in the incipient rating, then they probably continued to be those types as, or kind of those types of populations, as Dr. Orlando said, until 30, 40 years from then, and then people started moving out. And so, but it's still mainly multifamily zones. And so one of the places where gentrification has happened, or kind of a type, is lower income or minority neighborhoods with high proportions of multifamily. So it is certainly plausible it happens, but we also know that it doesn't happen in every neighborhood like that. And so sussing out why and whether it's the previous grading or not, I think would be an interesting thing that we could look at as well. And I don't think it's been done before.
Corey, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. This is really, really interesting. I was wondering how this fits in. It's not really a sort of question exactly, but how it might relate to the research. And this is informed a little bit by Keeanga-Yamada Taylor's work, especially in Race for Profit. And at least part of the argument that she gives around racial segregation in housing is that we don't do a whole lot to actually enforce the Fair Housing Act, or we do much less than is just taken for granted. And in particular, that we don't do create the legal framework to sort of actually dismantle what redlining did. And so this, I think, relates a little bit to what Dr. Orlando was just mentioning about the zoning and the changes around zoning, and then the recent campaigning around poor people coming to destroy your neighborhoods in the suburbs and all that kind of stuff. But I'm wondering a little bit about that as well. How much, multifamily housing is tracking race, not just because it was built and then unchanged, but because we don't actively do anything to dismantle the explicit racism of the past. We just sort of leave things in place. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So to give away some of my book, one of the things that I talk about at the end of it is, we are pretty careful about following the dictates of the market when it comes to certain things in real estate. I say certain things because, when it comes to people want to freely move into your neighborhood and you don't want them there, all of a sudden you're in favor of regulation. But a lot of how we build things is just, we build the bigger, nicer things in the more expensive areas. And so we follow the dictates of the market. What the Fair Housing Act would actually have us do, if we were going to really follow the spirit of the law, is it would say that in certain circumstances, the market was built on racist premises, right? I mean, the reason why certain areas are so wealthy and high value, a lot of research, including ours, shows, is partly because that they were engineered to be areas that would get affordable credit, affordable mortgages, and other areas did not. And so if you suddenly say, now I want the free market to operate, then you're going to be following a lot of the initial conditions that segregation already set in place. Now, the Fair Housing Act technically has two dictates that it's telling us to do. The first is it's outlawing discrimination. That's the part most people know about. That's the part most people are okay with, no active discrimination. The second part is that it says that the Secretary of HUD should affirmatively further fair housing, which most people have interpreted to mean exactly what you're saying. They should actively be trying to reverse the negative effects of segregation. In the 1970s, one of the things that Keeanga-Yamada Taylor talks about in her book, and other folks talk about, Mirza Baradaran wrote a great book on black banking a couple of years ago that I highly recommend. She goes into it too, is the Nixon administration was the key moment here, because the Nixon administration inherited the Fair Housing Act. Fair Housing Act was passed in April of 1968. A couple months later, Lyndon Johnson says he's not going to run for re-election. Richard Nixon gets elected. The Fair Housing Act is his to enforce, and he is not a fan of desegregation. Now, the funny thing is he appoints a HUD secretary, George Romney, former governor of Michigan, former president and chairman of American Motors, Mitt Romney's father, who is a liberal on race issues. He's a Republican, but he believes in integration. And he tries to push for what he calls open housing and open communities, which is if you have an all-white suburb and you refuse to allow somebody to build low-income housing in your area, you refuse to allow Black residents to move in, you're not getting any more federal funding. That's it. And Nixon axes that. There's no way he's doing that. He cuts George Romney off. So, I mean, what Kianga Yamada Taylor's book is talking about a lot, what she really focuses on, what she really uncovered for all of us who didn't know about it, was George Romney spent most of his time at HUD trying to adopt a very small portion of the HUD Act of 1968, Section 235, which was trying to get FHA insured mortgages into the Black ghetto, but they did it in a completely corrupt way, so that the people who got the mortgages were being duped into buying houses that they couldn't possibly maintain, houses that were falling apart, and they wound up just shooting themselves in the foot. And the reason that Romney winds up focusing on that is it's the only thing he can find, any part of the law that he's allowed to use to try to overcome segregation, because both the voters and the local residents and his own boss say, we are not letting you disturb the white suburbs. And ever thereafter, there really hasn't been a strong push for integration. There's been, I mean, you know, presidents have tried to do things to overcome segregation by, you know, directing more money into redlined neighborhoods. We had empowerment zones in the 1990s. We have opportunity zones now, you know, but what you really need to do is, I think you need to do two things. One is people have to be free to move, which means that if you want to be able to move to a high opportunity neighborhood, there has to be a housing voucher program that allows everybody to do that. And right now we dramatically underfund the housing voucher program, so that 3/4 of the people who are eligible can't get a voucher, so they can't move to high opportunity neighborhoods. And then you have to build housing for folks in those neighborhoods. And the zoning regulations currently make it very difficult to do that. And then you have to also invest in the redline neighborhoods so that you don't have to move in order to find high opportunity. You can get opportunity everywhere in America. That was a very long answer to your question.
That was a very long answer and very impassioned, but I wanted to bring people to that same, Corey, very, very good philosophical and practical question, because I think, you know, there's legal and non-legal books on enforcing or unenforcing the Fair Housing Act and its subsequent. And I see Rick has a question next, so we'll take Rick in a second. What I wanted to bring people to two specific policies, one local, one state, that I think are interesting interpretations of what we're talking about. So very recently, perhaps a month ago, if people have saw, the city of Evanston, Illinois, which is a relatively large suburb of Chicago, racially integrated to some extent for a long time and has its own particular history. They set up what I think is the first redlining reparations system for, I think mostly for Black residents. I say mostly because I think it's not so clear when I read the ordinance, who were impacted by housing discrimination, specifically redlining, but also other types. And again, Evanston, this is in Illinois, so not a slavery legacy, not even a Jim Crow legacy, but specifically housing discrimination legacy. And they give, I think, $25,000 per application, assume with some somewhat minimal proof that you were affected. Thanks, Corey, for that. And they think they're funded to give maybe about 20 or 25 of them per year for the next 10 years. So it's a small drop in the bucket, but it is an example of how it can be done. Now, the larger policy that I wanted to bring people, and many of us are in California, including CPP, is the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Program that the State Housing Agency does, HCD in California. They basically say places are growing or not growing at such and such a rate, and here's your current stock of housing by what's affordable or not affordable and somewhere in between, and here's how much at first it was we think you should build in this 8-year cycle, and now it's here's how much you have to build and go figure it out. And recently it's almost been like, and maybe we'll enforce it as well. So it's getting there, and I think it is a blueprint to some extent for how to do it, but the enforceability is high. If anybody's curious, look at the city of Huntington Beach versus Newsom or other types of things. I also think New Jersey as a state has a different also legally mandated way of distributing affordable housing throughout its myriad of municipalities and counties. So I'm not as well read up on that, but if people are interested, you should look at that example as well. And I want to go to Rick.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And this is all great commentary and great information. So from my background being in banking and to the research that's on the table here and what we've been discussing, what, if anything, whether it's a tangential or any component really, the CRA Act, the CRA of 1977, and how does that really, has that shifted, you know, in your determinations? I mean, how does that play into this conversation, if at all? And has it been able to move the needle in terms of equality, you know, lending to specific minority populations and or in regions that, you know, demographics are a bit greater, as we've been discussing, you know, in these redlined areas? I mean, does it have any relevance to this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's directly relevant. I'm going to go on a tangent for a moment. So just for people who don't know what the CRA is. So the Community Reinvestment Act was the brainchild of Gail Sincata. Gail Sincata lived in a redlined neighborhood. She lived in Garfield Park, Chicago, is where she grew up. And then she moved west to Austin, which was yellow lined. And so she spent her whole life in these neighborhoods. And as she was raising her children, she realized something very wrong about American education, which is that it's so tied to housing values. And so if you have areas that have very high housing values and very wealthy residents, they pay very high property taxes, and property taxes account for about 44% of school funding in public schools across America. So areas that have lower housing values have less money available for their kids. Their kids get lower quality educations on average, as measured by a lot of different outcomes. As a result, they earn less when they grow up. They can't move out of the red line neighborhood. It's a classic poverty trap. She saw this as a mother. She became a community activist. She pushed for two major laws in the 1970s. In 1975, she helped to write the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which is one of our favorite laws as housing researchers because it requires banks to collect data on mortgages, and it's one of the best data sets we get to use. But the goal was, of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, the goal was to figure out whether banks are still, after redlining has been outlawed, still not giving enough mortgages to certain areas. 2 years later, she pushes for the Community Reinvestment Act because the data that's starting to come out of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act shows that, yes, they are still redlining in certain ways. So the Community Reinvestment Act is a really strange law, in my opinion, because it is not directly enforceable. It is only occasionally and indirectly enforceable. So the Community Reinvestment Act does not give regulators an immediate way to penalize a bank that is redlining. However, it is designed to encourage banks to lend more in low to moderate income neighborhoods to creditworthy borrowers. That's important to understand. The goal is not to get them to lend to people who can't repay. So if you fast forward to the housing bubble of 2000 to 2006, when there were so many subprime loans that people in those neighborhoods couldn't repay, that was not what CRA was originally designed to do. It was to creditworthy borrowers who were being ignored because they lived in these neighborhoods that had a stigma attached to them ever since redlining. The way that the regulators encourage banks to do it is that they basically keep a rating system of how the banks are doing. And anytime the banks need the regulator's approval for something, which typically is they want to merge with another bank or they want to expand and open new banks. So basically, anytime they want to grow their business, since they're federally regulated, they need to get the regulator's approval. If they haven't done enough lending to those neighborhoods in their areas, then the regulators can say no. So it's only triggered if the banks want something from the regulators. It's a bit of a quid pro quo. As a result, most of the research shows that it doesn't do a huge amount to reverse redlining. It does encourage banks to issue more loans in certain neighborhoods than they otherwise would have. That's pretty clear. One of our, by our, I mean Brian Sieva and I, one of our mentors who got us all started in this field is Raphael Bostic, who's now the president of the Atlanta Fed. But he started out in the late 90s measuring whether mortgage discrimination still happened, looking at the mortgage data, and then looking at the effects of the CRA. And he did a survey of banks along with a couple of his colleagues at the Fed in 2000, where they found that it does encourage them to issue more loans in low to moderate income neighborhoods. The banks are issuing more loans, and they are, for the most part, profitable loans, which is good news, but they are a very small proportion of their portfolio. Long answer to get to, yeah, it does.
No, thank you. No, it's good. No, it's, I mean, I spent a couple of years in light tech and asset management of the underlying developed product. And, you know, this is, you touched on some stuff that I didn't really truly understand on the back end of it. So thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I
Alex?
think another, a second.
Or who's next?
Is there somebody else besides me? Anyway, thanks for that talk. That was really amazing and really persuasive. We have just a few more minutes left, so I would like to encourage folks to keep asking questions in the chat. So my question was kind of, you know, I think this is totally kind of complementary to your story, but I'm also just thinking about, and this is also related to Corey's question about the Fair Housing Act, but just about discrimination and prejudice in the housing market. And, you know, somebody in one of these single family zones who is choosing between a, you know, an offer from a white family and a black family, and they, you know, choose the white family instead, kind of stuff. And I'm just curious if there's any way to kind of control for that stuff in the analyses. One thing I'm sort of vaguely thinking about, and this is very half-baked, is all the kind of big data stuff, looking at like Google searches in areas, and they can look at average levels of explicit and implicit bias in different areas. I don't know how micro-targeted it can get down to like the specific little zones on the redlining map, for example, but just as an examples of like, you know, you might see higher levels of discrimination or searches for problematic terms in certain areas, and that might sort of be another factor that's correlating with this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to look into. The other thing it makes me think of is, you know, since the 2016 election, a lot of political scientists have been collecting surveys to measure racial resentment using both explicit and implicit measures in their surveys. And at this point, I would guess that some of those data sets get down to the neighborhood levels because they're trying to explain votes in, you know, the elections. Historically, you know, the best way I think that we've been able to show that discrimination still happens is what are called audit studies, which is, I think you guys had Gary Painter on the last panel, and he's done some of that where you send out blind applications. The landlord, for example, if it's rental, the landlord doesn't know who is sending in the application. They just see the name. And if it's a white sounding name or a black sounding name, which there's a linguistic way to figure that out, they get two completely different, you know, results, even though they're identical applications. And the same thing happens with mortgage lenders. But obviously that is not directly something we can put into our analysis. So what you're saying might be the way to do it. We'll have to look into that. I don't know the answer to Pritesh's question. And the reason I don't know is because it's something that Brian and Sieva and I are just starting to look into. It's a really important issue. So the question is about large institutional investors are starting to buy up single family homes. Well, they've been doing it now for a number of years, buying up single family homes in a lot of areas, turning them into rentals. And there's a concern that that could lead to gentrification. It could lead to changes in the housing quality. It could displace people, and the profits all go to Wall Street and don't stay in the neighborhoods. These are all important issues. There's also the other side of the argument that maybe they're restoring and renovated properties that would have gone delinquent, would have been vacant. Empirically, it has not been well tested. And I'll just say, since we're nearing the end of time, one of the reasons it hasn't been well tested is because if you've ever looked at a data set of housing transactions, it is messy. And if you try to identify if multiple houses are being bought by the same owner, good luck. Because that owner, first of all, is probably smart enough to break up their company into many different LLCs and buy up the properties under different names. And second of all, the county recorder is probably making errors all over the place. And sometimes they record a name with the middle initial, sometimes they don't. So you need a statistical technique that'll be able to identify when it seems like all the houses are probably being bought by the same owner. And that's what we're currently working on.
So this has been truly fascinating, very informative. I've learned a lot today, so I would like everyone to please bring your virtual hands together to thank our speakers for a really enlightening presentation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all for listening and for the good participation too.
Thank you.